Imagine an empire at the zenith of its power, stretching from the middle of modern-day Turkey to the borders of China, suddenly collapsing after the mysterious deaths of its king and his powerful prime minister, only a few months apart. This is the shocking story of the Seljuk Empire during its peak and its sudden fall. A journey into the era of Malik-Shah I and his Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, a period known as the Seljuk Golden Age, but one that had a bitter and enigmatic end. We want to explore how this empire reached such greatness, what its achievements were, and what happened that the deaths of these two men, Malik-Shah and Nizam al-Mulk, turned everything upside down. Our goal is to first understand that peak era and then arrive at the pivotal year of 1092 CE to see how these deaths acted like a domino, completely changing the course of the region's history. Let's start from the beginning. How did Malik-Shah rise to such power? He was the son of Alp Arslan, the great conqueror of the Battle of Manzikert. From a young age, the very young Malik-Shah gained experience in warfare and statecraft alongside his father and, more importantly, alongside Nizam al-Mulk, preparing for the future. But his father's death in 1072 CE was very sudden. Alp Arslan was killed during a military campaign, and just like that, Malik-Shah became Sultan. It wasn't that easy, however. Immediately, his uncle, Kavort, the ruler of Kerman, laid claim to the throne, arguing that as the elder brother, the right was his. This is where things became difficult for the young sultan. At this critical moment, Nizam al-Mulk's role was vital. It can be said that without Nizam al-Mulk's support, Malik-Shah's task would have been much harder, and he might not have succeeded at all. Nizam al-Mulk was a highly experienced, intelligent, and extremely influential vizier who had also served Malik-Shah's father. He staunchly supported Malik against Kavort in a very important battle known as the Battle of Karaj Abudulaf in 1073. The result was Malik-Shah's victory, and Kavort was later executed. This victory firmly established Malik-Shah's position as the absolute sultan, and thus the foundations of what we call the Seljuk Golden Age were laid. During this era, the empire reached its greatest extent, from Anatolia and the Levant to the borders of China and Yemen. It was a truly vast realm. But how was this massive empire administered? Nizam al-Mulk's role went far beyond military assistance. He was, in fact, the chief architect of the empire's administrative and cultural structure during Malik-Shah's reign. First, he moved the capital to Isfahan, making it the center of power. Then, through the Diwan al-Wizara, the ministry, he established a highly organized and centralized administrative system, a kind of powerful bureaucracy, to manage this vast territory, which was a monumental achievement for that time. But perhaps his most important and famous work was the establishment of the Nizamiya schools. This was not just a single school, but a network. The purpose of these schools was not merely education and debate. They had strategic objectives. To promote the Sunni Islamic perspective, which was the official ideology of the Seljuk government. To counter the intellectual influence of powerful rivals like the Ismaili Shia Fatimids of Egypt. In effect, it was a form of soft power warfare. To train administrators and officials loyal to the central government. In other words, they were developing a cadre for the empire's future. Nizam al-Mulk was a pioneer in using a state-sponsored education system to consolidate political and ideological power. His vision was not just for the present. He was thinking decades and perhaps centuries ahead. His famous book, Siyasat-Nama, or Siyar al-Muluk, the Book of Government, is his masterpiece, in which he wrote down his principles and experiences in governance. It served as a practical guide for kings and was read for centuries afterward. Alongside this strong management, science, culture, and art were also heavily supported.
Nizam al-Mulk himself was a great patron of scholars and men of letters, the most famous example being his friendship with and support for Omar Khayyam, the great poet, mathematician, and astronomer. Malik-Shah himself, unlike many warrior kings, was interested in science and ordered the construction of the great Isfahan Observatory. One of the results of this observatory's work was the creation of the Jalali calendar, which remains one of the most accurate calendars in the world and is named in honor of Malik-Shah's title, Jalal al-Dawla. Architecture also flourished during this period. Significant parts of the Great Mosque of Isfahan, such as the Nizam al-Mulk dome and the Earthen Dome, said to have been built by his rival Taj al-Mulk, are legacies of this era. There is an interesting point here. Although the Seljuks were of Turkic origin, the Persian language became the primary language of the court and the bureaucracy. Nizam al-Mulk and many of the viziers and scribes were Persian, and this led to the spread of Persian culture and literature throughout the empire. But of course, no era is without its challenges. The most significant internal challenge the empire faced was the rise and growing power of the Nizari Ismailis, whom we know better by the name Hashashin or assassins. Hassani Sabah and his followers, who were a branch of Ismaili Shi'ism, managed to capture the Alamut fortress in the Alborz Mountains and make it their base. They were opposed to the Seljuk government, and their method of struggle was very different. Instead of open warfare, they focused on the targeted assassinations of high-ranking Seljuk political and military officials. With a highly organized and secretive structure and devotees, Fadayan, willing to give their lives, they became a truly serious and troublesome security threat to the empire, a force that could not be easily fought. And this brings us to that eventful and fateful year 1092 CE. First, Nizam al-Mulk was assassinated. The official and famous account is that while Nizam al-Mulk was traveling with the royal camp near Saneh in Kermanshah, a man dressed as a Sufi approached him and severely wounded him with a dagger, and Nizam al-Mulk died shortly after. The finger of blame immediately pointed to the Ismailis, as Nizam al-Mulk was their staunchest enemy and had repeatedly sent armies against them. However, other very serious theories exist. For example, intense court rivalries. Nizam al-Mulk had extraordinary power, which created many enemies for him. His most important rival was Taj al-Mulk, who was also a vizier and very ambitious. Some sources say that Taj al-Mulk and his supporters, especially Turken Khatun, Malik-Shah's powerful wife, had a hand in the assassination. Some even cautiously point to the possibility that Malik-Shah himself had grown tired of Nizam al-Mulk's excessive power and influence, who acted like a perpetual father figure or atabeg to him, and might not have been displeased by his removal or had even ordered it, though this is just speculation. The death of such a powerful figure alone could have shaken the empire. But the main catastrophe was that only a few months later, perhaps less than 40 days, Malik-Shah himself suddenly died. This is where the story becomes very suspicious and strange. Malik-Shah was at the height of his power, only 37 years old and healthy, but he suddenly fell ill in Baghdad and passed away. At this point, everyone certainly thought of a conspiracy. Again, there were several main suspects. Supporters of Nizam al-Mulk, who may have wanted to avenge the assassination of their vizier by targeting the Sultan. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, al-Muqtadi Billah. Malik-Shah had recently clashed with the Caliph and even planned to depose him. Thus, the Caliph had a strong motive to eliminate Malik-Shah. And, of course, the same court factions, such as Taj al-Mulk and Turken Khatun, who now wanted to install Turken Khatun's younger son, Mahmud, on the throne, and may have played a role in poisoning Malik-Shah. Whatever the case, the result was the same: the nearly simultaneous death of the two main pillars of the Seljuk Empire, the Sultan and his Grand Vizier. This event was like an earthquake and suddenly brought the empire to the brink of complete collapse. It was as if all that greatness and glory were connected to these two men. Immediately after Malik-Shah's death, complete chaos erupted. A civil war for succession began. Malik-Shah's sons, such as Barki Yaruk, Muhammad Tapar, and Sanjar, as well as his brother Tutush, who ruled in Syria, all laid claim to the throne and turned on each other. That unified empire quickly disappeared.
These civil wars severely weakened the central authority and led to the de facto fragmentation of the empire. In this chaotic internal situation, a few years later, around 1096, the First Crusade began. When the Crusaders arrived in the region, they encountered a series of Seljuk principalities, each fighting with the others. The unity and power that existed in Malik-Shah's time, which could have stood against a foreign force, no longer existed. This weakness and disunity among the Seljuks greatly contributed to the Crusaders' initial success. In this power vacuum, local commanders known as Atabegs, tutors of Seljuk princes, gradually gained power and established nearly independent dynasties for themselves, such as the Zengids of Mosul and Aleppo, from whom Nur el-Din Zengi and later Saladin would emerge. However, Sultan Sanjar, one of Malik-Shah's sons, managed, after much fighting, to maintain a powerful state in the eastern parts of the empire, Khorasan, for about 40 years, and is considered the last great Seljuk ruler. But in the west, the Seljuks of Persian Iraq, who were constantly in conflict and growing weaker, were finally defeated in 1194 CE by the Khwarezm Shahs, and the chapter of the Great Seljuk Empire was formally closed. This turbulent story shows us how an empire that had reached the pinnacle of cultural, scientific, and military glory under the leadership of Malik-Shah and the unparalleled management of Nizam al-Mulk fell so quickly into a vortex of civil war, fragmentation, and weakness with the mysterious and nearly simultaneous deaths of these two men. This story truly reminds us how fragile power can be, even at its peak, and how dependent it can be on a few key individuals, and how, with their removal, the entire structure can collapse. Now, a question remains for reflection. Imagine if Malik-Shah and Nizam al-Mulk had not been killed in that year and had lived for another 10 or 20 years, and that stability had continued. What fate would have awaited the Middle East and the Islamic world? Would the Crusades have proceeded as they did? Could the Ismailis have gained so much power? Would local powers like the Zengids and Ayyubids have emerged in this way? There are no definitive answers to these questions, but thinking about it shows that the events of 1092 and the deaths of these two men were truly a key turning point in the history of this region.